Hey, this is April, and this show, SetSet, discusses psychedelics. It's intended for audiences 21 and over. Also, I am not a medical expert. If you are looking to engage with psychedelic substances, please consult your physician before doing so. The morning I recorded this episode, I was on a walk with a friend. Although it was raining here in Seattle, she asked me who I was interviewing, and when I began to explain the work of today's guest, Abby Rosner, who is a journalist and author interested in psychedelics, aging, elderhood, I noticed myself slowing down and choosing my words carefully. Because I don't know this topic personally. I am aging, but I am just about to reach the halfway point rather than having fewer years ahead of me than behind. If I spend much of my time in an altered state in reflection at this point in my life, I cannot imagine what that will become with more years and more learning on which to reflect. Today's conversation is about psychedelics and aging and what happens when people encounter these medicines later in life after careers, caregiving, marriages, grief, and loss have already shaped our psyche and our nervous system. This conversation is educational. It's not medical advice. We'll talk about research, lived experience, and uncertainty without instructions, dosing, or promises. Psychedelics are powerful. Context, preparation, and integration matter. What we're really exploring here is meaning, and more specifically, meaning making, and what changes when time itself becomes visible. Abby will be a guest at our next Psychedelics Salon at Town Hall, Seattle on February 5th. She'll be joined by Dr. Emily Winkin, a naturopathic physician and integrative mental health specialist, and documentary filmmaker Scott Wright. For more information and to grab tickets to join us live or to stream the salon, check out the link in today's show notes. As Abby begins sharing her story, I want you to notice something. She doesn't frame psychedelics as a return to youth. She frames them as something that landed differently because of age. And that distinction matters. I would love for you to familiarize the audience with how you came to write about psychedelics and elders.
Okay, that's a great topic and a great question. I bring my own personal experience because I consider myself the consummate boomer exploring psychedelics. I was born in 1958 and grew up in the 70s. I smoked a lot of pot and I dropped acid, then put it all behind. I finished college, got married, had kids, and lived this straight life. Alcohol, the glass of wine was my drug of preference. When I got to my mid-50s, my marriage was ending and my kids were grown. I rediscovered cannabis and found that my relationship to it was very different as an older adult. I'd been meditating for many years. I experienced all kind of things in life, and I found that life experience really grounded me as I was exploring these expanded states of consciousness. On my 60th birthday, I got the book How to Change Your Mind, Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind, as a birthday present. When I read that book, I thought, if psychedelics are so effective, he wrote about the clinical trials, psilocybin therapy for people with existential angst over their terminal cancer diagnosis. So I thought we all have a terminal diagnosis. And as we get older, we become more aware of our mortality. If this can help, why wait until you're at death's door? Maybe we can move up the advantages of these experiences and have them earlier on so that they can impact the way we live our older lives. That was my theory. And I decided to see if that was really a thing. I started to do research for my book. I quickly discovered that it truly is a thing and that there is a whole swath of older adults, people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, that are exploring psychedelics. Documenting that phenomenon was what got me started in this.
What I hear in Abby's story isn't nostalgia, it's regulation. By midlife, the nervous system has data. It's tracked disappointment, responsibility, rupture, repair. So when someone encounters an expanded state later in life, it's not happening in a blank body. It's happening in a system that already knows impermanence. That changes the experience. I connect with how you found yourself here because I, too, find myself here based on my own personal journey and curiosity. It's a lucky place to find ourselves. I am curious, seniors versus elders. I find myself not knowing how to label people my parents' generation. My mom was born in 57. I don't wanna call you boomers because now that has such a negative connotation, although I think we've flipped it on its head and it's fun now. But seniors versus elders, how do you see that distinction?
That's really an interesting point. It points to this position that our generation, I guess I don't have any other name to call it other than boomers. We're entering older age now. We're the generation that came of age in the 60s and 70s. And now we're in our 60s and 70s, entering older age in a society that doesn't make much place for us. The messages we get are anti aging, death phobic. There's no concept of what it is to be an elder offered in our society. The tendency for us as the generation that revolutionized youth is that imprinted with our youthful identities. And it's really so much a part of who we are. We experience this kind of dissonance between our youthful self images and our aging bodies. What psychedelics offer us is this: we don't have to choose between being young and being old. We can connect with our joyful, youthful selves and experience the awe and wonder of children. And we can also have profound pleasures of young adulthood. We can temper it all with the wisdom and maturity of lives fully lived. That to me is what an elder is: somebody who incorporates all of those identities. The beauty of what we're discovering now is that being an elder is the culmination of everything you've experienced in your life. You don't have to put away your young self or disregard that you're aging. We have such negative feelings about what it is to be aging. And I feel like that's unfortunate that really we can embrace that as just being an inevitable and beautiful phase of life.
This is where psychedelics and elderhood intersect our culture hasn't really named. We don't have a shared language for elderhood in the West. We have anti-aging, we have still young, we have don't let it show. Elderhood, it isn't decline, it's integration. Holding youth and age in the same body without forcing one to disappear. That's not a mindset shift, that's a nervous system shift. I'm going to be 50 in March. For the last decade, as soon as we turned 40, everyone started poo-pooing the fact that we were getting older. I found that to be very frustrating because they weren't speaking for me. It seemed like they were aging themselves by seeing themselves as a person that was aging. If you were thinking about aging in terms of your attitude, your access to internal thoughts and feelings, but that is not how our society sees aging. It's not a gift. Thing you're constantly fighting against. I try to be compassionate for people that have invested so much in how they look up to that point. And to see that start to not serve them in the same way must be very terrifying. At the same time, what did you think was going to happen?
These are laws of nature. When you get into a good expanded state with psilocybin mushrooms or whatever, you understand that this is the way of the world. This is the natural order of things. Everything arises and blooms and passes. Embracing the impermanence of life instead of resisting it is a hallmark of elderhood,
Right.
healthy living in general.
As a person who is a child of people in the generation ahead of me, I had a journey this weekend. I took 2 grams of psilocybin, and it's hard to surrender to what you cannot change for the people who are older than you, that you would really like for them to be able to see their potential, to embrace their potential, to know that it's not too late. And so
Well,
to see someone like you who is with 2 arms, I'm embracing it is amazing. And when I was reading the piece that you shared with me that will go live on Substack and that I'll link to in the show notes, it occurred to me that there is this opportunity that your generation has to almost create initiation rites with psychedelics for Western society, perhaps? So, how do you see that? Like being able to shape how my generation uses psychedelics to move into my next phase?
Well, I love that you mentioned the rites of passage because one of my original ideas for the book I was writing was to talk about these experiences as rites of passage into elderhood. What I was realizing was that it wasn't like one rite of passage that you do and all of a sudden, okay, now I'm an elder. It was an ongoing exploration, ongoing opportunities to explore elderhood. And you continue to evolve through your elderhood just like you evolve through the other stages of your life. In terms of the gift you mentioned for my generation, it's also a gift for the generations that follow. We can offer the younger generations a much more healthy, positive role model for what older life is. I talk about how we're the generation maligned for all the awful things that happened on our watch. But if we can offer the younger generations a more positive model for aging, that would be a beautiful gift. I hope with my book that I can normalize for older adults the idea that you can explore these experiences, something very special to offer at this time of life.
One of the things that you and I connected on was meaning making, right? That is one of the things that can come through when you're working with psychedelics. Can
Yeah.
you talk a little bit more about what meaning making is?
I encountered this concept of meaning making when I'm reading about the trials of psychedelic assisted therapy with people experiencing end of life distress. This experience of finding meaning is very helpful in older life.
When Abby talks about meaning making, she's touching on something we do see in research. Clinical trials with psilocybin for end of life distress show changes in how people relate to fear, identity, and mortality. The studies don't claim psychedelics remove grief or fear. They suggest something more subtle. People report being able to hold those experiences without being overwhelmed. That's not transcendence, it's capacity. My personal hope is that as I age, I will have a greater capacity to hold emotions and experiences on which I reflect with curiosity and without judgment. That capacity really matters when you are trying to make sense of it all.
I wanted to deconstruct what does that actually mean? What does it look like to find meaning in older life? For my book, I interviewed about 36 older adults about their psychedelic experiences, and there were many expressions of meaning making. It really helped people understand the narrative of their personal histories. They could understand the person that hurt me so horribly when I was a child. Actually, they didn't know what they were doing. They were just living out their own trauma. There was a lot of healing that came in their own personal stories. People in older life, after you finish your career and after your kids are grown, when you'd have these experiences, it opened a space for expressing their true inner voices. Who really am I in this life? They have an opportunity to explore those parts of themselves that had been subdued for decades. That offered a lot of meaning in terms of understanding themselves. On a larger spiritual level, the meaning was not just of themselves as an individual, but as part of this cosmic enormity. You're at once everything and nothing, embraced in love, awe. Those experiences give an additional layer of meaning, especially in older life, as we approach the big mystery of what happens when we die. And I think that having that foretaste of what is it to surrender your ego and submit to this larger experience could be considered a trial run for dying, both from the individual storytelling and the larger spiritual aspect. These experiences can offer us meaning in older life.
Of the 36 people that you interviewed, was there a universal part of their personality they were suppressing? Was it creativity or sexuality, or did it vary? I'm curious if there are themes that you pulled out.
I love that question. Thank you so much for asking. One of the things I did find, not that what they were suppressing, but that was common in most of them, was that they self-defined as seekers. These are people that have been asked their whole life, pretty much. They've been asking questions, asking the bigger questions. When you get to your 50s, 60s, and 70s, your life becomes simplified because the trajectory of whatever has been occupying you has shifted. Then you have an opportunity to attend to these larger questions. For some people, the question was, how do I want to live my life? There are people who carry horrendous levels of pain and trauma. One of the things that I heard over and over again was, if not now, when? Do I want to live another day bearing this pain? If there's something that maybe can help me to resolve it. Another theme that came up was, how can I live more authentically? And what am I suppressing? Creativity, sexuality. Am I going to live my whole life because I had sexual trauma as a child? Am I going to live my whole life without experiencing joyful intimacy? If I have an opportunity to expand my conscience medicine work and really take this on, the motivations I think are many, but I think it's really a moment of truth that we come to an older age, which is, how do I want to live my remaining years? And now I have the time, I have the resources, the curiosity, the courage, the maturity. So I think that that's really what's happening. And what I'd like to bring up, if it's okay with you, is the topic that we talked about, which is this historic moment with the crossing of paths between the aging boomer generation and the psychedelic renaissance. So what I see, this boomer generation, or the generation that came of age in the 60s and 70s, we were exposed to drugs. Even if we did them or didn't do them, they were there. They were everywhere in the zeitgeist. We may have experienced them recklessly for fun or not at all, but as a culture, we weren't ready to benefit from what these experiences can offer. At the same time, psychedelics were being examined as medicines. They were being examined in popular culture, but there wasn't really a maturity or an understanding of how to work with these very potent medicines. The counterculture blew up. The war on drugs happened. The boomers went about their lives. We forgot all those medicines, and 50 years went by. As we lived our lives, we had our experiences. In parallel, the psychedelic medical research track started to really develop. What we've discovered now is that we know how to use these medicines. We know from clinical trials the protocol for how to use these medicines safely and meaningfully. We know that they can be treatments for depression, end-of-life anxiety, PTSD. They're now coming back into the mainstream, about to get FDA approval, strongly established underground, and with a real appreciation of these medicines in a cultural context, recognizing that these are medicines that have roots in indigenous cultures and that they are sacred medicines. We've got this mature understanding of the medicines. We've got the boomers coming into older life in a society that isn't answering their spiritual needs. And so they're coming together, creating this historic opportunity, which is what I've seen is really, we're on the cusp of having this beautiful encounter. So that's what I'm seeing right now, which I find very exciting.
And the fact that your generation has such large numbers.
Exactly. There's millions of us. I don't believe that this is ever going to be a mass movement. I think it's always going to be a niche phenomenon because most people are fine with going on with their lives. It's the seekers, the people that are saying, wait, isn't there something more? They're the ones that are going to be searching this out. But most people are comfortable with their status quo.
I totally agree with that. I think there comes a time when people in my generation, their parents pass away, their spouse might pass away. The things that have kept them making decisions that make other people feel comfortable fall away. It isn't until later in life that they feel like they can finally start becoming a seeker and asking
Sure.
questions. If this dialogue weren't happening, they wouldn't know where to go or even know that they could find themselves. I do think there is this gift of it's never too late and you can do it above board, right? And that makes a lot of people feel better and safer. I think that there is probably for the generations behind boomers more opportunity for them to find themselves because of this opening.
The boomers were trailblazers in the youth coming up with this revolutionary new youth culture. And I think they're trailblazers now in forging this new elderhood. And may the generations behind us have an easier path because of it.
Totally. One of the questions that I actually, when I was on my walk this morning, I was explaining that your generation has less resistance to psychedelics. And that is, I think, because there was progress on the academic side and on the clinical research side up until Nixon declared the war on drugs. In fact, Bill W. of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, famously did over 100 trips of acid.
Right.
And then that's actually why he's found sobriety, is what is the thinking. And then it was taken away.
Right.
And it's just like today, my sons are teenagers. You can't fool them. They see it all happening. And you all saw that too with the Vietnam War. And all of a sudden, drugs are bad. They're studying them at Harvard with incredible results. There is a thinking portion of your generation that is, wait a second, why was that taken away? Yes, there was medical research that was happening between, let's say, he declared war on drugs like 1969, maybe.
Yeah, 70.
71, in the mid 80s, they started researching again, but it wasn't very easy to get a DEA exemption. I think it's probably people in your generation that fought or research it again because they were like, wait, we were just getting started here.
I'm thinking of Charles Grob. He picked up the mantle and said, we have continued the work that we were doing. What makes our generation more receptive? I don't know if it's really the case because it's hard to talk about the boomer generation as a monolith. There's billions and there's obviously all kind of variations. I think the war on drugs really did a job on us. I think that image of the fried egg, your brain on drugs, was really hard to shake. I feel like the biggest resistance we're able to overcome now is the fear of the bad trip. Older adults, every time I'll just talk to somebody that my generation, and I'll say, they'll say, "Oh, what are you writing?" I go, "Oh, I'm writing a book about psychedelics and aging." Either they'll blanch, like just go, "Oh, drugs," or else they'll go, "Oh my God, tell me more." This concern over the bad trip, I think the fact that we can point to the understanding that with proper set and setting, with following the protocol for safe journeying that's been validated in hundreds of clinical trials.
I'd like to pause here because this is where harm reduction language really matters. Research suggests that challenging experiences are not rare. In fact, the number is somewhere between 1 in 5 psychedelic experiences can be challenging, taking a year or more to unwind from, make sense of, and the data shows that women are more likely to have a challenging experience. We believe this is a result of our hormones. Older adults may experience fewer long-term difficulties, not because psychedelics are safer with age, but because they approach the experience with safety in mind. Preparation, intention, and support tend to be stronger. That doesn't erase risk, it contextualizes it. And it reminds us that healing isn't about avoiding difficulty. It's about having enough support to move through it. We could really learn something from our elders on this one. 1 in 5 people have a challenging experience.
Now, challenging experience doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad trip. I'm not saying that people don't have challenging experiences. What I'm saying is that the outcome that you're going to have serious psychological problems afterwards is going to be an issue. I've read one study, and there seems to be some signs that older adults are less susceptible to having extended problems because we're more intentional. If you work at creating a safe setting, prepare yourself, and you work with a facilitator, you do everything that you need to do to have a safe experience. Yes, obviously, if somebody has a latent psychotic episode, that can trigger it for sure. But in general, people can do their own risk benefit assessment. I think that the risk, if you follow the guidelines and the protocols, is manageable.
I agree with you in that people equate a bad trip with their brain never coming back.
Exactly.
And it's true, underlying psychotic ailment or an undiagnosed psychotic disorder, right? That you could potentially not come back from that. But I think once you get into later life, you would know if that exists.
The thing about older adults is that they can make their own decisions. They can do the research, they can learn everything that they want to learn, and then they can decide if this is a risk that they want to take or not. Though I think it's an entirely different story for teenagers or young people. But here we're talking about people that are looking the next decade or 2 or 3 of their lives. If they want to do something that entails some risk, but could potentially give a lot of benefits, then at least they should be able to have the information so they can make an informed decision.
That is such an important distinction I've never heard anybody bring up, which is managing your money. The younger you are, the more risks you can take, but there's an inverse correlation in this case. The older you are, you're like, why wouldn't I take a risk on this?
Absolutely. In the medical space, they're really understanding that psilocybin, particularly in a controlled setting, got a really high safety profile.
Yes.
So
What are some of the ways that you've seen people prepare for engaging with psychedelic substances? Which medicines are you seeing people gravitate toward?
the surveys overall of psychedelic use in the American population shows that psilocybin is the most popular one. And I'd say that's the case for older adults. It's the easiest on the body, the mind for older adults. MDMA comes in second. MDMA is more problematic because of the cardiovascular issues that can be raised with it. So that's, I think, is also popular. But for older adults that have heart issues, really need to do their due diligence and speak to their healthcare providers. What was the second part of the question? It was, how are people preparing? So there's a whole gamut of ways that people are preparing, growing their own mushrooms and doing it themselves, to working with underground facilitators, to working with therapists and facilitators. A lot of people are working with professionals who that's their skill set, is to help people prepare and experience psychedelic medicines. Now, I would say that in my opinion, the options Colorado and Oregon offer for state-regulated, legal, facilitated psilocybin experiences, I think for many older adults are an ideal option. A lot of older adults, they don't navigate they don't know how, they don't want to navigate the underground. They don't want to do something illegal. A lot of people say, I don't want to break the law. So they can go to Oregon or Colorado and have a facilitated experience with psilocybin in a completely legal context. State legal framework is going to be enough to allow that. I think that those are really good options. Some people, they have the means to go to Jamaica to a retreat center. At the retreat center, they'll prepare them for the experience. Definitely in a structured setting where a lot of the people I interviewed prepared for their experiences.
I would imagine that's one of the reasons why elders are not having the numbers of challenging experiences, right? Because they are choosing to be supported.
It's a function of maturity. We were reckless in our youth, and now we're more intentional. A skill that we developed after a lot of hard knocks.
Yes, I see that in my own choices.
You become more careful about what you do.
There's more self-love there.
Exactly.
You've seen so many things go wrong. You do know it can happen to you.
I think that desire that people have to go deeper and to really experience something larger in life happens in older age. I think that's why a lot of these people are willing to assume some element of risk so they can experience something that's really meaningful.
One of the topics that I think is driving people to psychedelics is grief, and grief applies to so many things. How sometimes we deny our grief for decades. So I'm imagining that elders confront grief when they're under the influence. How are you seeing people navigate that? What's the integration like after they finally allow themselves to acknowledge that there was something painful that happened in their life?
I've heard that in a number of people that I interviewed, this encounter with grief. There was a man in his 70s, and he said one of his purposes for one of his journeys was he wanted to experience grief because he said, I've had so much loss in my life. I've never been able to cry. I've never been able to experience grief. He wanted that to happen, and it didn't happen. I asked him, did you cry? He said, no. But then afterwards, he wrote to me and he said, in fact, I did cry, but it was tears of joy. Some of the other people that I interviewed talked about weeping for hours, just opening the floodgates of grief to weep and cry and mourn. One gentleman told me about how he called it encountering Our Lady of Sorrows. It was a man who grew up Catholic. He said, I spent my journey with Our Lady of Sorrows. I just made room for her. That was his beautiful experience. When you have these experiences, they're very cathartic.
Grief shows up again and again when we talk about psychedelics and grief, especially later in life. For women, grief has been deferred, contained, postponed in service of everyone else. Sometimes that's the case. Maybe most of the time that's the case. What I appreciate here is the permission Abby gives grief to move without needing a storyline. From a nervous system perspective, grief isn't pathology, it's discharge. And when grief finally has space, joy often isn't far behind. At least I'm counting on that. Not because we earned it, but because the system can finally breathe.
I can just say from my own experience, one of my journeys, I grieved the whole time. I just sobbed and cried. And as I got up from my crying, I started to dance. And I had this realization. It was one of these profound realizations that grief and joy are in the same. I'm holding grief and joy together in my hands, that they're two sides of the same coin. You don't have one without the other. It was such a beautiful realization. And it stays with me to this moment. This is the world that we live as humans. There's grief and there's joy. You can't have one without the other. When you quit resisting grief and make place for it, then you're really living life fully. And I think that's really one of the opportunities that elders can appreciate.
The amount that you will allow grief to hold its place in your heart, that same capacity is how much you have to allow joy to take its place.
I think that's the beauty of what these medicines offer, particularly psilocybin. It really allows the feelings, the insights, these fundamental truths be expressed.
Whether or not you're happy with them.
We don't need to be happy all the time. When you're an elder, you understand that there are losses and everything changes and you lose things, your youth, your loved ones, your job. But at the same time, there's things you gain. It's just a balancing act.
What is something that you've gained that has surprised you with your relationship with psychedelics and your elderhood?
I Thank you for that question. I found my tribe.
Community becomes non-optional as we age, for women especially. After decades of caregiving, emotional labor, and coordination, there's often a quiet question underneath all of this. Who holds me now? What I hear Abby naming is not psychedelic community as an identity, but as infrastructure, mutual care, shared meaning, people who know your story, and they don't judge you for it.
I feel like I have really found the people who are open-hearted, who are willing to connect in really meaningful ways. And that's just been a joy. I think that what that touches on is a point very important for me as I look at the whole picture of psychedelics in older life, the aspect of community. These experiences done in community, which is the way they've traditionally been done throughout history, can build very meaningful connections between individuals. As we go into our older life, community becomes more and more important, not only psychologically, but also logistically. We're looking at issues of caregiving for older adults. The institutions that people have relied on forever aren't necessarily going to be around for us. And I feel like we're going to need to create communities of mutual care that are going to take care of each other as we get older, take care of ourselves logistically, emotionally, socially. And so I feel like there's a real opportunity here. It's one of the things that I'm going to be exploring, how to create communities of older adults who study, meditate, journey, do community service together, and care for each other through their older life.
Is that showing up in your life?
That's a vision that I have,
Okay.
something that I want to create. Once the book is out, I want to really start to create this idea of a model of these communities that's replicable.
Before we conclude, this book that you've mentioned, what's the name of it? When's it coming out? What are some of the highlights that people can expect?
Book is called Psychedelics and the Counterculture of Aging, and it'll be available in bookstores in July. There are two parts to the book. The first part, I explain to boomers what's happened in the field of psychedelics for the last 50 years. I talk about the developments in the research. I know the guidelines for safe and meaningful journeying, avenues of access. The second part of the book is more of an exploration of what these experiences offer us in older age. I illustrate accounts from people I interviewed. I divide the chapters into healing our psyches, connecting to our authentic selves, experiencing love and forgiveness, connecting to spirit, connecting to our ancestors, experiencing intimacy and pleasure, and practicing letting go. The last chapter concludes with this vision of psychedelics for creating community. The stories, the people's accounts are the beating heart of the book. They're real, authentic, candid, vulnerable. Anybody who reads this book will come away with a grounded and nuanced understanding of what these experiences offer in older life.
How did you find your subjects?
Wasn't hard. I've been writing about psychedelics in older adults for a couple of years in different magazines. People would reach out to me, and I kept their names. So I just said, would you be willing to be interviewed for my book? And they said yes. I also joined a community of underground facilitators in this area. It's a professional network. And I told them about the book, and they referred clients to me.
Thank you for sharing that. I will make sure that your Substack is linked in the show notes. Before we close, I want to name a few grounding truths. Preparation matters, support matters, integration matters more than the experience itself. Psychedelics are not shortcuts. They don't replace therapy, community, or time. And intensity, especially later in life, is not a requirement for insight. Sometimes what changes us most is not what happens in the experience, but how we live afterward. This conversation stays with me because it doesn't rush toward answers. It respects aging as a real psychological and physiological transition, not something to fix or outrun. If this episode stirred something in you, I invite reflection, not necessarily action. What does elderhood mean in your body? What feels unfinished? What no longer needs to be carried alone? Thank you for listening. Thank you to Abby Rosner for naming what so many people are quietly feeling. And I encourage you to check out our show notes for more information on the Psychedelic Salon, that Abby will be a featured guest along with Dr. Emily Winkin and documentary filmmaker Scott Wright here in Seattle at Town Hall Seattle on February 5th. Take good care of yourselves and one another. I'm April, and until next time, I have one last request. If you liked this episode, please rate and review us wherever you're listening. It really does help more people find this harm reduction information. Thank you so much for listening.